Amelia and Scott Flaters seemed a happily married couple with 2 loving children. But the nightmarish events of that night irrevocably shattered the public's perception and left their friends and loved ones wondering what really happened and why. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
When police officers arrived at the Flater home, they found 42-year-old Amelia dead in the pool. Her husband, Scott, was immediately placed into custody. And the home was sealed off as a crime scene. Within minutes, homicide detectives John Norman and Randy Chapman arrived on the scene.
We had a briefing between myself, Detective Norman, and Sergeant Richardson, and we were told that an individual was in custody for the crime. They had found no weapons, the body was still on the scene, and there was some blood spattering and blood staining around the swimming pool area.
While Detective Chapman combed the murder scene for clues, his partner, John Norman, interviewed Greg Coons, the neighbor who had called 911.
He told me that him and his girlfriend heard a noise. He went out into the backyard and he could see Mrs. Flater laying on the ground, and she was rolling a little bit and moaning. He observed Scott come out of the house and stand over the body. Then Scott pushes her in and holds her head down. Then Greg ran inside to call the police, tell them that there was something going on.
As Detective Chapman examined the physical evidence, a chilling story of murder began to emerge.
I immediately noticed there was some blood trace and staining on the carpeting just inside the Arcadia door. I made the assumption at that time that someone had acquired blood on the outside of the scene, on their shoe or their foot, and as they were walking across the carpeting, it transferred from the shoe to the carpet. Just to my left, there was a staircase that led to the second floor. I noticed that there was some small pea-sized gravels. I then made the assumption that the person involved in this had got these pebbles stuck to his feet on the outside by blood sticking to them and then transferring them to his feet. And when he started up the stairs, they dislodged and came loose.
When the detective examined Amelia Flater's body, there was no doubt in his mind that this was a crime of passion.
There was numerous stab wounds about her upper torso, chest area, and her breasts. When I examined her hands, I found that her wedding band was missing, and it was apparent that she wore a wedding band as the skin was discolored on her ring finger where the wedding band would have been. I found through my experience that oftentimes during the heat of battle or during an argument that the woman will remove her ring and place it somewhere or throw it at someone or throw it outside or just get rid of it.
Based on the physical evidence and Greg Coons' eyewitness account, investigators were confident that the murder weapon was hidden somewhere on the premises.
There was a sidewalk leading from the swimming pool toward the garage door. When I got to the end of it, I shined my light around the door frame and the garage door opening itself, and I noticed that there was some blood staining on the frame of the door and some blood staining down near the doorknob.
At first, a search of the garage yielded no evidence. Then, Detective Chapman opened the trunk of the family's car.
I was standing looking at the tire well area, and it looked like it had been disturbed somewhat. The tire well wasn't set exactly flat, so I was able to lift the tire well up, and when I lifted it up, I found all these garbage bags inside the tire well. On the inside, I could see bloody Levi-type pants in there, and there was a Tupperware container in there. Inside the Tupperware container, we found the large hunting knife that was approximately 10 inches long, and there was a athletic mouthpiece inside there also. At this point in the investigation, I am certain that Mr. Flater has killed his wife.
Scott Flater was immediately taken to the Phoenix police station for questioning.
The eyewitness account of Emilia Flater's brutal murder and evidence recovered at the crime scene left little doubt in the minds of authorities that Scott Flater was the killer. And while any seasoned investigator knows there are two sides to every story, nothing could have prepared homicide detective John Norman for what he was about to hear.
Scott Flater was brought to the Phoenix Police Department for a videotaped interrogation.
Homicide, does that mean my wife is dead?
When you walk into the homicide room, there's a big sign that says homicide. Scott said to me, homicide, does that mean she's dead? And so I told him, yeah, that's what it means. And then he went into his crying act, which he never produced any tears.
What brought all this on? You tell me what happened.
Flater claimed he could remember nothing about the night's violent events.
He said he went to bed 9:30 at 10, and Yarmela was still watching TV when he went to bed. Next thing he knows, he hears a noise, he comes downstairs, and the police jump him for unknown reason.
Obviously you think I did it. I don't know what makes you think that.
Well, because I had a neighbor staring at you watching me do it, that's why. You know, he just kept denying, I don't know. He wouldn't give me any information.
I'm sorry, I don't remember doing it.
During the interrogation, Detective Norman noticed a small bandage on Flater's right hand.
When I asked Scott how he got the cut on his hand, he had no explanation, didn't know where it came from. He also had blood behind his ears and under his arms. Where did you get the blood on?
What blood?
Blood all over your neck.
Here?
Around on you and stuff.
I didn't know there was blood on me.
Some of the things in an interview that you'll look for to see if they're deceptive is they won't look you in the eye when they talk to you. They crouch over, they get their arms together. He was doing all kinds of obvious signs to me that he was deceptive. Turn this way. After the interview with Scott Flater, I took blood samples. I removed the blood from his ears and under his arms. I took his clothing, which had some blood stains on it, and then Scott was taken down to jail and booked.
You're charged with homicide, first degree. You understand the charge?
Yes, I do.
Scott Flater pled not guilty, despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. As his trial approached, Flater shocked the legal community with a bizarre defense. He claimed he was not responsible for his wife's brutal murder because it was committed while he was sleepwalking. Deputy County Attorney Juan Martinez was assigned to prosecute the case.
My reaction to the raising the sleepwalking approach was the same reaction to that I have to all defenses. You have to take them very seriously, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself on the losing end of a trial. She went down. She started to go down. She went down to the ground.
In his opening statement, Juan Martinez described in graphic detail the final agonizing moments of Emilia Flater's life at the hands of her husband.
Scott Flater performed many acts during this so-called sleepwalking episode. He lured his wife out to the darkest part of the yard.
Scott Flater then proceeded to stab his wife 44 times.
Knowing that he had bloody clothing on, he then went to the garage, took off all of the bloody clothing, stuck that in a trash bag, found himself a Tupperware container, stuck the knife and the mouthpiece that he was wearing into the Tupperware container, and then went over to the back of the Volvo automobile that he owned, opened the hatchback, and stuck all of these items into the wheel well. More importantly, after that, he went upstairs, and knowing full well what he had done, he washed up. He then walked downstairs, noticed that the dog was there, told the dog to be quiet with a hand gesture, went over and stood over his dying wife and heard her gurgling to death. He made sure he was going to take care of this business of her still being alive. He stuck his hands underneath her back, put her in the pool, and to make sure that she was dead, he put his hands on her head and held them down there until she took her last breath.
The coroner's autopsy revealed that Emilia Falater died from drowning, something the prosecution contended proved premeditated murder.
Bottom line is, he killed her. It makes absolutely perfect sense.
This is not the case about who did it or how it was done.
The defense was quick to counter.
Scott Falater was in what is known as a somnambulistic, automatistic state. In short, he was sleepwalking at the time the event occurred, and he had no consciousness in his mind operating at that time. In fact, his brain was in fact asleep.
One of the things that the defense did is they conducted sleep studies. This was to ascertain whether or not the defendant could possibly be a sleepwalker. They indicated that he had small amounts of what is called slow-wave sleep, which are indications of sleepwalking.
Juan Martinez worried that these tests could cast enough doubt in the jury's mind to set Scott Falater free.
Although there was little doubt that Scott Falater had murdered the woman he said he loved, he claimed he had no recollection of the gruesome crime. Falater's bizarre sleepwalking defense would draw national attention and result in a courtroom showdown between expert witnesses.
It started as a benign sleepwalk, became a violent episode, and then proceeded through a confusional arousal until he was arrested.
The defense used experts that were well-renowned in the sleepwalking field. For example, they used Roger Broughton, who is probably the most noted sleepwalking expert in the world. They also called to testify Rosalind Cartwright, who's also well-noted in the area of sleepwalking.
It's my opinion that he was sleepwalking.
The evidence that they presented in the courtroom was that, in their opinion, that the defendant, when he stabbed his wife, when he hid all the clothing, when he went about washing himself, doing all of these things, was sleepwalking.
I think all the evidence says he was awake, and all the evidence says his behaviors were far too complicated to be sleepwalking.
The prosecution countered with their own experts.
Dr. Mark Pressman and Dr. David Barrett testified that it was impossible for an individual to conduct such complex tasks while he was sleepwalking. It would be virtually impossible for Scott to come down, stab his wife 44 times, then take the clothing off of his body, put a knife and the mouthpiece in a Tupperware container, and then conceal the Tupperware container. And as he opened the hatchback, he didn't just put the trash bag in there. No, he didn't do that. What he did is he actually opened the wheel well where you put the spare tire, and that's where he put the trash bag.
The prosecution's key witness was Greg Coons, the Falater's next-door neighbor who had witnessed the crime.
Greg Coons was so important to the prosecution because he could speak to the complexity of the behaviors of Scott Falater. Additionally, he could tell us that Scott Falater was walking around just in normal fashion.
Scott Falater's sister testified that Scott had exhibited similar types of complex behaviors while sleepwalking in the past.
He was at the kitchen, turning the faucets on and messing around with everything around the sink. There were a lot of dirty dishes there and stuff. And he didn't answer me, and I just kind of stood there watching him. And then he turned around and lifted me up and just tossed me through the air.
But the one witness everyone wanted to hear from was Scott Falater himself.
I have no memory of what happened that night. The thing I do know is that I loved my wife.
He put on the so-called geek defense, that he was some sort of geek kind of person, that he was so mild-mannered and so peaceful that this is something that he would never do. He seemed to have rehearsed his testimony. When he was testifying, he would apparently cry. Yet during cross-examination, he showed no emotion at all. So the records from the police are wrong then?
That is correct.
Juan Martinez was determined to expose the truth and challenged Falater to explain the physical evidence which pointed to premeditated murder.
The defendant was wearing a mouthpiece at the time that he killed his wife. When he was asked about it on cross-examination, he offered a very sort of limp response by saying, well, when I go through the garage, I put anything that I see in my mouth. Well, that really didn't address the issue why that night he would have picked a mouthpiece to put in his mouth as he stabbed his wife. There's no other explanation other than that you wanted to make sure that your teeth weren't cracked during the attack.
Even more damning was the murder weapon itself.
The fact that Scott Falater used a brand new knife indicated to the state that he had planned this. Why would he go out and buy a new knife if it wasn't to kill her?
The prosecution's final piece of evidence was the injury on Falater's hand that was inflicted during the attack.
One of the hardest things that Scott had to overcome in his sleepwalking trial was that small little cut on his hand. It's difficult to take a little bitty Band-Aid and put it on your finger. It made it really hard to believe that he could do that while he was sleepwalking.
One of the things that came up here, and Mr. Martinez suggested to you, that this defense is some kind of a sham. Well, it's not a sham. Sleepwalking and homicide or violence is real, and every expert has said that. Every expert has confirmed that this is something that really happens.
After 30 days of trial and dozens of witnesses, the fate of Scott Falater was finally in the hands of the jury. A seemingly confident Scott Falater awaited their decision.
The jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. Signed foreperson Michael E. Riley. Is this your true verdict? So say you one and all?
Yes. When the verdict was read, Scott Falater showed no emotion. I believe he showed no emotion because he knew that he had premeditated her murder and that he was not sleepwalking at the time that he killed his wife. I know that there's nothing we can do to bring her back, and I know there's nothing we can do to make sure that she didn't suffer as much as she did, but there was justice. He was found guilty of premeditated murder. He did it, and that being the case, yes, I do believe that justice was done.
After his conviction, Scott Falater continued to maintain his innocence.
I told the truth, and you know, I'll still stand by that truth, whatever the consequences are.
But his chance to plead his case was over.
My 25 years on the police department, 7 years in homicide, I've never had a case that was so easy and had so much evidence, but was so hard to prove.
Scott Falater is serving his sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, Arizona.
The penalty phase of Scott Falater's trial, his children made an impassioned plea to the court to save their father from the death penalty. The judge honored their request and sentenced Falater to life in prison. To this day, Falater maintains he has no recollection of the murder.
And there's more all-new Arrest and Trial to look forward to every weeknight from 8 here on CI.